Hello and thank you for joining this new episode and chapter of News, War and Spirituality. This time joining us all the way from the UK, from Oxford, Neville Hodgkinson. Hello to you, Neville.
Hello, Netanel. It's great to be with you.
Thank you very much for finding the time. Journalist, spiritual leader, author of books, having all the news that are coming from Gaza regarding the kidnapped people, from Israel, regarding the war, regarding what is happening here in Israel from our studio in Tel Aviv, and your basic thought, also as a journalist, what would it be?
It's rather different. As a journalist, so often the task seemed to be to highlight conflict. With the path that I've been following with spirituality, there is much more of an emphasis on trying to go beyond conflict, which doesn't make news in the same way, but which is actually really important for our futures. I came out of retirement as a journalist, actually, during the COVID disaster, because I saw many mistakes being made in the handling of that crisis, which, as a former medical correspondent with the newspapers, reminded me of mistakes that I'd seen previously in other circumstances within medicine. And so it was a big struggle to be writing about that, to try to do it, to be factual, to be accurate, to give people vital information, but trying not to allow my feelings to take too much of a part in my description of what was going on, because my feelings kept telling me, this is crazy, this is really bad, they're making things worse than they need to be, there's been a cover-up about the origins. All sorts of feelings like this were coming as I went deeper into it, but it was actually a good test for me in trying to maintain that objectivity in reporting.
You know, Neville Hodgkinson, you're talking about keeping your emotions away, but yet during the big drama that is actually happening in the daily life in Israel and the negotiations that are taken care of between Israel, Hamas, ISIS, United States, and Egypt and Qatar regarding the release of the hostages, let's see one story, one personal aspect of what is basically happening right now here in the Middle East.
Hello, can you hear me? Am I getting through to you? Hello, do you miss me? I hear you say you do, but not the way I'm missing you. Kiss the rain whenever you need me. Kiss the rain whenever I'm gone too long. If your lips feel lonely and thirsty, kiss the rain and wait for the dawn. Kiss the rain, kiss the rain. Hello, can you hear me?
Well, Yael, you're seeing the pictures of Neville and Tal and Shoam, an entire family that was kidnapped out of their homes suddenly on Saturday. So as a journalist that is struggling between his journalism profession and the spirituality teachings, how would you react when you are seeing this kind of atrocity?
You have to do your utmost to present it, to show people, and sometimes it's not just a question of facts. It's also the feelings that are being experienced, the courage, the fear, the sorrow, all of that. It's important for all of that to be reported. But at the same time, it feels so important to somehow keep your position of being an observer. You have to empathize, but not get caught up. Otherwise, your own judgment and your own reporting will become distorted. I was remembering that incredible film Schindler's List. I've often recalled it. Steven Spielberg made that amazing movie. And, one of the things that amazed me about that was the way Oskar Schindler was able to do so much good, even whilst being a Nazi Party member, because of the cool head he kept in the midst of that. If he'd reacted to the horrors that he was seeing and rejected the way some of the Nazis that we were seeing in that film were behaving, he would have been discarded and put on one side completely, either possibly disappear altogether. But because he kind of steered an amazingly neutral path, even though you could see on his face when he saw some of the things happening, there was distaste, of course, but somehow he kept an ability not to be destroyed by his anger and rage at what he was seeing. Instead, he kept that coolness, and thanks to that cool head, he did so much good in the midst of horror. I've never forgotten that.
So basically, you're recommending the Israeli and the international and maybe the Hamas press also to keep to the fact-checking, put as less emotions as possible, and keeping to the stand of the observer regarding the almost so much damage and so much sorrow that is being seen here in the state of Israel for the last weeks?
Yeah. Yes. It's said that I've never been a war reporter, but it must be very difficult because you are going to be regarded as a traitor if you don't support the feelings and the perspective that are being put forward on your side. So it's very difficult. But the best reporting, I feel, has come from journalists who didn't mind risking the fact that they might be regarded as letting their own side down sometimes for the sake of doing what they saw as reflecting as accurately as they could the situation as it was unfolding. And that doesn't mean hiding facts. It doesn't mean hiding feelings and reporting on feelings, but it means maintaining a certain dignity, I suppose you could call it, inside in the being of the observer, so that you don't lose your judgment. That's the key. I've noticed that within my own life, there have been times where I've got very wound up about things, but often if I act in that kind of mode, even though it feels like it's the right thing to do at the time, but often the consequences are not good. So that's why I feel that Oskar Schindler's example was just so powerful.
I would like to show with you, especially enabling your background as a journalist and author that writes also about health, to show you a report that comes from an Arab Israeli correspondent that is doing lots of buzz on the media and doing a report regarding a hospital, the Arabian Shifa hospital, in which, according to the checks of the IDF, some of the hostages were kept and at least one of them was murdered after she was kidnapped from her house in Israel. I will show you the report.
Hamas is willfully endangering Gaza civilians for the sole purpose of carrying out acts of terror. These are the true colors of Hamas. What more proof do you need? For years we've been telling the world that hospitals in Gaza are in fact terror bases. For years the world turned a blind eye to it. Doctors knew, nurses knew, people on the street knew, foreign doctors knew. So you really expect us to believe that the UN, the World Health Organizations, Doctors Without Borders, and dozens of other humanitarian organizations did not know too? Those who knew and remained silent for years do not have the right to criticize Israel in this situation, because they are complicit. But now that the IDF is in Gaza fighting against Hamas terror, the cat is out of the bag. The IDF found proof of Hamas using hospitals, schools, mosques, and residential buildings. In fact, under the hospitals in Gaza there are tunnels with weapons. Video evidence from October 7 confirms that hostages were taken to the Shifa hospital, not for treatment because there are hospitals that are much closer to the Israeli border, but because the hospitals were prepped for purpose of bringing hostages there. Hospitals are supposed to be locations to save lives. Instead, Hamas knowingly turned Gaza hospitals into legal targets in a war they launched against Israel. Hamas is willfully endangering Gaza civilians for the sole purpose of carrying out acts of terror. These are the true colors of Hamas. What more proof do you need?
My feeling when I listen to that is that it was a loss of judgment on the part of those responsible for reporting accurately what was going on, that if that was the case and had been for a long time, and yet people were hiding from it for reasons of loyalty to one side or the other, that is where the problem lies. We know that terrible things have been taking place. They should be reported accurately, but when you take sides, it might even be for emotional reasons rather than for nationalistic reasons. You just don't like violence, or you don't like to think ill of other people, or you like to think that you're taking a balanced position. But any of those things where you're following something that is rather to do with your upbringing, your conditioning, if you like, rather than really seeing the truth of the situation, all of those get in the way of reality. And that, in my view, is the biggest problem that we face when we don't understand reality, and when we hide from reality, or when we distort reality.
And we're conducting this live to tape show from the UK, from Oxford, and you're also seeing the reports of the BBC and other media that are transmitting from the UK, and they have apologized once and more. But do you think they are doing the accurate work of journalism?
I've seen the BBC in particular. You know, I mentioned how I came out of retirement to report on COVID, and I've seen them following a very biased line on that issue, really quite disgracefully betraying the British public and indeed the world, I would say. With regard to the conflict that you're speaking of, I suspect that there is a mindset within the BBC that is predisposed to one side. But I know that there are also many good people within that corporation who are wanting to reflect the situation fairly and accurately.
It's interesting. You wrote one of the many excellent books that you wrote is I Know How to Live and I Know How to Die. So is there any tool, any understandings from your literature regarding I Know How to Live or I Know How to Die that can be implemented in this conflict of, I don't know, we're here within the war the last weeks, but maybe some decades now. So what tool or understanding from your book can be implemented here and now?
Yeah, my book was based on a subtitle was The Teachings of Daddy Yankee, and Daddy means elder sister. She was my mentor in London for many years. She died a year or two back at the age of 104, which was pretty good. But she was a very strong individual who taught me an enormous amount. The root of the teachings that she shared was that our problems arise from over-identification with roles and not enough attention to souls, in a nutshell. Souls being the inner being, the core of our being, that is something deeper than the identities that we take on from parents and schools and national identity, that there is that element to us that is where we can actually unite as having all come from from one source, one pure consciousness. We're like, the way I understand it and have understood it from these teachings is that there is that one pure being, and it differentiates into the multiplicity of consciousnesses, individuated consciousnesses, which we call souls. The scientific language, as in a new paradigm that's emerging in science, is that your individuated consciousness. And originally, every consciousness is a chip off the old block, if that is an expression that's familiar. We have that godlike purity of consciousness, of an ability to be loving and peaceful as our original nature, but we've got an overlay of other stuff resulting from all sorts of experiences through time.
As you were sharing that you were taught by Daddy Yankee, one of the world's spiritual leading leaders of Brahma Kumaris, and how love, purity, deep understanding, listening, connected to the divine that you are talking and writing about can be implemented. Why people are, and people here in Israel are asking that in all the TV shows and everywhere, and we'll be in Jerusalem in a few minutes also, broadcasting from there, questions to you. So how these novel virtues can be practically implemented in the times of war?
It takes tremendous quality to be able to do that. May I quote to you? I don't know if you've come across his work, but there was a wonderful interview I saw with Professor Sam Vaknin. Have you come across him? He's an Israeli psychiatrist. Actually, he's a professor of clinical psychology.
Please share.
And he adopted the kind of stance that I think ideally journalists should have also on this conflict. What he was saying was that he felt that both sides were suffering from a victim identity. Not that both sides had not suffered real suffering, real victimization. The victimization is there in the sense that what the Palestinians referred to as that catastrophe when they lost their lands. The Israelis, the Jews, had suffered the catastrophe of the Holocaust and centuries of anti-Semitism. So both sides have got some these tough experiences. But when you identify, this is what he was saying, when you identify as a victim, you weaken yourself and distort your judgment, and you perpetuate the problem. So I feel, but he wasn't pretending that it would be easy to get over that. But he did spell out really interestingly what it can lead to. That, for example, he says there's things like, I'm a bigger victim. And if you've got that victim identity, you're feeling I'm the bigger victim, and you lose your perspective that allows you to see the situation in the round. You become focused on your own suffering, and you damage your ability to see the wider picture. And he kind of went through a number of psychological mechanisms, things like splitting. He said, I am all good and whoever disagrees with me is evil and must die. You know, you might be able to see that on the other side, but his argument was that both sides have an element of that, which is one of the reasons that this conflict gets perpetuated and gets worse and worse. And another one, he said, he called it pathological narcissism. You need to be noticed, whatever the cost, which I thought was an extraordinary possible explanation of what would otherwise seem like a suicidal action on Hamas's part. You need to be noticed, and to save face, you act irrationally. So various mechanisms that he sees working in all of us as individuals, he also saw as working in these societies. It's not that everybody's like that, but that there's a problem like that. The reason I'm mentioning that in answer to your question is that he was saying the way out is to look to the future rather than to continue to be affected by the past. Past orientation has to do with a helplessness that you've learned, an anger, a feeling of being the victim, the belief that everything is hopeless. You could get a better outcome if you were to have an approach that guaranteed stability, economic growth for the region. But he did add that he said this horrible atrocity could be leveraged to make peace. Unfortunately, I don't see the leadership on either side to do this. So where the real answer here is, where is that leadership going to come from? I mean, that's not an answer, it's a question, but you know, I thought this was an amazing analysis.
Using basically the ability to first not to be seen from both sides as victims, and another recommendation that comes from your views, your books, your literatures, your teachings, is also to try to visualize the future, the peaceful picture of the futures, and maybe if the leaders cannot provide it, so it's going to be bottom up from the people.
I like that. I think I saw your interview with Sister Genti of the Brahma Kumaris, in which she said that every drop makes a difference. So every time we can look even within ourselves and see, well, my compassion went missing there. Let me see if I can repair that. Every drop like that is building for a better future.
Another stand with the cameras of ContentoNow is in another part of Tel Aviv. We have a question that is coming from there, please.
Hi, my name is Yuval Aviram. I'm 20 years old, live in Tel Aviv. I think I'm going to ask you something right now. What about love in these days? We really need your love in Israel right now. We feel lonely.
Feel lonely, the need for love. Yes, yeah.
Hearing that from the UK, from the Chile Oxford perspective, what would you answer, Yuval?
That love is, if we look for that love from one another, we may find some, but we're liable to be disappointed. But I feel that the call of this time is for all of us to renew the love inside ourselves through relationship with the divine. I feel as if there is an unlimited source of love, which actually puts everything right in the world. And I do believe, as you were indicating, that a better future must lie ahead. I see us as at a critical stage in humanity's development, which may be an awakening call for all of us to reconnect to that pure source of truth about ourselves, which is that we are love, we are peace, but of course we know that we've lost it because of these limited identifications. So the key is to connect ourselves to that one. That we think of the Jews as having a strong sense of Yahweh, isn't it? Our understanding is that the Jewish tradition has that sense of one God, whereas in Europe, often these days, I would say it's almost disappeared. The churches are nearly empty. But we need silence. We need periods of introspection. We need to remove our concerns from this external world from time to time in order to recharge that inner battery of our own love and peace, and then bring that into the world. I'm not sure we can do it by demanding it from others, but we can make a difference by invoking it from the divine.
You know, you've mentioned the leadership in Israel, the leadership of the Hamas, the leadership of the world, and there was one interesting quote from the former president of the United States, Barack Obama, regarding the conflict after the October 7th war.
That what Hamas did was horrific, and there's no justification for it. And what is also true is that the occupation and what's happening to Palestinians is unbearable. And what is also true is that there is a history of the Jewish people that may be dismissed unless your grandparents or your great-grandparents or your uncle or your aunt tell you stories about the madness of anti-Semitism. And what is true is that there are people right now who are dying who have nothing to do with what Hamas did. And what is true, right? I mean, we can go on for a while. And the problem with the social media and trying to TikTok activism and trying to debate this on that is you can't speak the truth. You can pretend to speak the truth. You can speak one side of the truth. And in some cases, you can try to maintain your moral innocence, but that won't solve the problem. And so if you want to solve the problem, then you have to take in the whole truth. And you then have to admit nobody's hands are clean, that all of us are complicit to some degree. I look at this and I think back, what could I have done during my presidency to move this forward as hard as I tried? I've got the scars to prove it. But there's a part of me that's still saying, well, was there something else I could have done?
So basically, as a journalist, as an author, as a spiritual teacher and student,
spiritual aspirant.
Yes. What would you tell the world leadership from your perspective? Who, because people here are basically measuring the suffering in Israel, within the Palestinians, how can be a different perspective of who is right or who is wrong, who is suffering more, who is suffering less? Because right now, in Israel, there is a tremendous grief. It never happened here since the Holocaust. What is happening right now?
But I guess it must be, we're not seeing much reporting actually from the ground in Gaza, but I guess it must be pretty intense there too. And it's just so important to not to take sides, I feel. Yes, there's right and wrong. Yes, some people behave more outrageously than others. Yes, mistakes are made deliberately. Well, mistakes happen sometimes subconsciously, and sometimes there's deliberate cruelty. But somehow the situation is a product of years of difficulty. It hasn't been addressed adequately. And I've a feeling that the right way to address it is that there should be someone of a Gandhi kind of status, or like Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, these guys who, you know, as Sister Genti said, the British had done plenty of wrong things in India, and yet Gandhi never lost his respect for them, even though he fought to get rid of them. And it was similar with Nelson Mandela. He somehow miraculously oversaw a peaceful transition from the horrors of apartheid to a more democratic setup. So it can be done. But I guess as a journalist, I would say, if I could see some signs of that kind of understanding, it would be really valuable to report on them, rather than to be whipping up emotion for one side or the other. And we've seen some of that in this country, where there are a lot of people who have immense love and empathy for what's happening to Israel, but there are also a lot of people who are empathizing with the Palestinians. And taking positions on one side or another just seems to make things worse. But if we can look for that way forward, where, as this professor said, that we're building something better for the future, and take some benefit from the tragedy that has happened, rather than just be further victimized by it. If we can look forward and trust that actually within human affairs, the divine does play a part, and that truth does re-emerge always, eventually, this is my conviction, we can have a more optimistic view of the situation.
We'll have another question in a minute. Yet in the UK, there was also a huge, almost eternal conflict within Ireland that was solved. Is there anything from your perspective that can be implemented here now in the Middle East during the news, the war, some spiritual tool from there?
Yeah, it has to be said that the Irish question arose. There was actually an American came over to help negotiate that, but both sides were weary. They'd battled this out for so long, each side thinking that they were right, and then eventually, with the loss of life and the disruption of everyday life, both sides came together to try and find a better way forward. And I'm remembering also, I've heard about it, I don't know the detail, but after Germany's humiliation of the loss of the First World War, it's said that the humiliation that they suffered provoked such an emptiness in the country's self-respect that it laid the grounds for the rise of Nazism. And in the wake of the Second World War, something called the Marshall Plan was instituted, which aimed to avoid that kind of suppression of one group, and actually helped Germany to regrow and become one of the most civilized European nations.
So you would recommend that the entire world, including Israel, if we're talking about a victory picture in the future, will be part of also rebuilding Gaza, creating it as a better possible place to live, and not a huge worldwide most biggest refugees camp?
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, absolutely. Because you're breeding. It's like as long as you're. I heard people saying how this is evil, 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 and it is. The actions are evil, but ultimately the people behind them are not evil. I don't believe that. I believe that the core of the human spirit is profoundly good, but we behave badly when we're not allowed to flourish in one way or another, and it comes about through our own wrong actions as well. But we must always have that hope that underneath the evil actions there is humanity waiting to flourish when the right terrain is provided. Definitely.
Neville Hodgkinson, we have another question that is coming from the TV crew here in the other part of Tel Aviv.
Hi, my name is Talia. I'm originally from Australia and I live in Israel. The question I wanted to ask today is where is the world for our hostages that are being kept at the moment?
It's something new to me, to tell you the truth. I've not seen anything that favors the idea that these hostages should be forgotten. I suppose, I think there's been a lot of reporting about the efforts to get a truce and get a deal where some of the hostages are released. I suppose it would be difficult for people to demand the total release of all the hostages while Israel continues to pursue the policies that they have decided upon, or at least that the IDF has decided upon, to clear the land in order to prevent this disease from erupting again, which is understandable, but there's an awful lot of suffering associated with that. And so it's also understandable that Hamas would keep the one negotiating card that they have. It's a terrible situation, but and it was particularly sad when we learned about the deaths of some of the hostages. But I don't pick up that there is one-sidedness on that issue over here.
You've mentioned with lots of love and respect your mentor, the teacher, Daddy Yankee, which is one of the world's greatest leader in Brahma Kumaris. And if you would visualize her with your kind help in this show, and she was witnessing the questions, the atrocities, the testimonials that are coming from the war in Israel, what do you think she would react? What would she say?
She had a very, very close relationship with what we call the Supreme Being, which is not a person, but it's more than an energy. It's like an entity that you can connect to and understand when you free your consciousness from the pull of the material side. We are spirit, and there is a supreme spirit. And she had so much diligence in freeing her spirit during her long life that by the end of it, she felt as if she had God as her companion. And she would definitely be arguing that there is purpose in everything that is happening. It's not God's plan that we should be suffering in this way, but that let us wake up. Let us treat this terrible, terrible episode as another means of prompting us to realize where we've lost the plot by being over identified with the material realm and forgetting the spiritual realm, because that is a very widespread disease, she would call it, in the sense that it's a dis-ease. It destroys our happiness when we don't know how to renew the spirit through that relationship. Let me tell you one story that might illustrate this. It's very dear to my heart. It's absolutely at a personal level, but in a way it's very relevant to this whole thing of letting go. There was an occasion when she was speaking in Oxford and I was emceeing the program. It was a conversation with an architect, a top architect, and that was how it was billed. But the architect spoke for some minutes, and then Daddy Yankee started speaking for some minutes, and there was no overlap. She wasn't addressing what he had said exactly. And so I thought, I've got to make this is billed as a conversation. So after she had been speaking for quite a long time, I tried to intervene, and she said, "Ek minute," it means 1 minute, with a, and she carried on. I tried again a few minutes later, and when I tried a third time, she was only pint-sized, less than 5 foot tall, but she drew herself up and she said how she hated it when the British, when she was a child and the British were in India, how they talked down to the Indians. In other words, kind of in front of this public audience, accusing me of talking down to her. And I was really hurt. And I just sort of stuck my feet out and let go for the rest of the program. But that night, when I returned home, I tried to deal with the hurt and I couldn't. And in the end, I decided that I would go and have it out with her. And I drove down early the next morning to London, where she had returned there after the talk. And I confronted her in her room. I said, "Daddy, what you said last night was like a dagger in my heart." And, anyone else might have said, "Oh, don't be so silly," or "What do you mean?" or "You misunderstood me," or, any one of a run of things like that. Instead, what she did, she put her hand on her chest and she said, "Pull it out, pull the dagger out." And I did. There was spiritual power there that was so strong that it ended it just like that. I know that that's one individual, and this is a far more complex situation, but these things can be transcended. But it takes a lot of strength to stop, to let go of the past and have that future vision, as that professor was urging us to do.
You're coming from a Western discipline. You're being hosted here from where in Tel Aviv, you're in the UK, in Oxford. You've been a journalist, an author, and you're talking about spiritual values, about the profound encounter with your mentor, Daddy Junkie from Brahma Kumaris. How would you perform and react towards your focal points of people, the readers and others ones that are being cynical regarding that? Hey, maybe he was caught by a cult. It can be that he's really talking about spirituality during this midst of war. He's a serious person. You're a journalist. What is happening to you? So what would you tell them?
I'm not sure I've been very good at countering criticism like that. I've had plenty of it, actually, because I've been following this path of attempts to improve my own virtues, if you like, to re-emerge, my own decency in the face of quite a lot of tendencies of ego and defensiveness and anger and so forth. I've been working on this path for many years, and when I began it, feeling that there wasn't enough love in my life or in the life of my family, there was quite a lot of misunderstandings. But after a few years, I went back because I stepped back from my full-time job for 2 or 3 years. Then I went back into the business, and I didn't speak about the spirituality, but I started to show the improved qualities that were emerging in me. And I had my best years in newspapers, actually, because I was more kind of sympathetic. Even if I was criticizing, it wouldn't be at a personal level. There'd always be that attempt to maintain respect for the individual. And that made a big difference to my reporting and to my relationships in the office, where previously I'd been very ego-driven, and I performed well because the ego made me, really give so much to the work. But the relationships were deteriorating. So it's more the proof is in the pudding rather than in what you say.
Thank you so much, Neville Hodgkinson. Sometimes even in the media, just reflecting 1 minute of silence reflects with no words the main message that you wanted to pass to the hearts of the people. I want to thank you, Neville, so much for finding the time, for sharing your understandings from the books, from the journalism, from the spiritual teachings during this episode. Thank you.
Thank you, Netanel. And really, I just want to congratulate you from the heart for doing this work, because it's really tough when feelings are running high because of the horrors that have happened, to try to link these various factors of the reporting and the war and the spirituality. It's a wonderful endeavor, but takes courage. So more power to your elbow. And thank you very much for the interview.
Thank you so much for joining us all the way from the UK, from Oxford. And thank you for joining also this episode of News, War and Spirituality at ContentoNow TV.